In this tutorial, we're doing the poem I Have My Father's Voice. It's a South African poem. It's by the poet Chris van Wyk. He's a relatively modern South African poet. He is a person who lived during the apartheid era. So you know that in this particular poem, although it isn't expressly or explicitly an anti-apartheid poem, this is a poem that is going to relate in some way to the idea of apartheid, or it's going to have as a foundation the influence of apartheid within the poem itself. The poem deals specifically with identity. You can tell from the title, I Have My Father's Voice, that what he's actually talking about here is the kind of person that he is and how that person relates to his father. What he inherited from his father. I got my father's voice. So it explores how we inherit certain characteristics from our parents and how those characteristics define us, even when we're adults. And in this particular poem, it also talks about how those characteristics, how some of them have contributed towards not only the kind of man he is, but it contributed towards him becoming a poet. And it speaks about what a poet might need, some of the qualities that a poet might need. Indirectly, of course, referring to the fact that he got those qualities from his father. Now, it's worth noting that in this particular poem, the speaker and the poet are the same person. It's not always the case in poems. Sometimes the speaker is a fictitious narrator that the poet might have created, or a fictitious character. But in this poem, obviously, it's a semi-autobiographical kind of poem. And so the speaker in this case is Chris van Wyk himself. Before we look at the poem itself, I'm going to introduce to you a literary device that you might not yet have encountered, and that is the device of synecdoche. It's a literary device in which an entire thing, the whole of something, is described with reference to a part of it. So as you can see from the examples here, it would be something like he asked for her hand in marriage, where her hand refers to the entire person. Or how do you like my new wheels, where the wheels refer to the entire car. And obviously in this poem, the voice is referring to, in some respects, to his father as a whole. So let's just take a look at what we'll do is we'll go through the poem as a whole, and then we'll just break it down the way we usually do, step by step, and break it down into parts. I have my father's voice. When I walk into a room where my father has just been, I fill the same space as he did. From the elbows on the table to the head thrown back, and when we laugh, we aim the guffaw at the same space in the air. Before anybody has told me this, I know, because I see myself through my father's eyes. When I was a pigeon-toed boy, my father used his voice to send me to bed, to run and buy the newspaper, to scribble my way through matric. He also used his voice for harsher things, to bluster when we made a noise, when the kitchen wasn't cleared after supper, when I was out too late. Late for work on many mornings, one sock in hand, its twin an angry glint in his eye, he flings dirty clothes out of the washing box, vests, jeans, pants, and shirts, shouting anagrams of fee, fo, fi, fum, until he is up to his knees in a stinking heap of laundry. I have my father's voice too, and his fuming temper, and I shout as he does. But I spew the words out in pairs of alliteration and an air of assonance. Everything a poet needs, my father has bequeathed me, except the words. You'll notice from this poem that there's no particular structure. There's no rhyme scheme. There's no particular rhythm. It's comprised of many short, irregular kinds of phrases that are cobbled together to create a sort of a loose montage of memories. And this is because the poem is talking about the idea of memory and about the things that he recalls about his father. And memory is not a structured thing. It's not a particularly linear thing. So the structure of the poem physically mirrors the disorganized nature of memory, not just the way in which one remembers, but also the way in which one processes memories and recollects them and reflects on them. So that's why this particular poem doesn't have any structure necessarily. It's just him recalling things about his father, and of course, ultimately relating those things to himself. So let's look at it stanza by stanza, even though they aren't really specific stanzas. We start this poem off in the present tense. He says, when I walk into a room, but then he says where his father has just been. So in the first two lines of the poem, you've got the present tense of him walking into the room, but also referring to a place where his father has been. So we know right away that he exists in the present, whereas his father is already relegated to the past. But because he puts those two concepts together, he becomes the present embodiment of who his father once was, because he goes on to say that he fills the same spaces that his father did. He exists in the same space. And he repeats that phrase later on, that idea of the same space. I fill the same spaces, and we aim our laugh at the same space in the air, because that references the fact that both he and his father existed within the same context. Now, this is an indirect reference to the context of apartheid. As you saw from the initial slide, they both lived during apartheid times, obviously, being people of color in South Africa. They both lived in the same place, and they lived in a place that during apartheid was designated as a colored place. So the definition of space would have been something quite relevant to both of them. And he talks about them existing in those same spaces, even though they might not necessarily have existed in the same time all the time. What you also see in this stanza is that he talks about the small physical mannerisms that are similar that they share. They both put their elbows on the table. They both throw their heads back when they laugh. And he uses the word guffaw, which incidentally is a word for a certain word for a laugh. But like any words that we encounter in poems, we've got to look quite carefully at what that word means and what the connotations of that word are. And guffaw is a loud, heartfelt, sincere kind of laugh. It's genuine, it's real, it's unselfconscious. And so just that word on its own tells you something about the kind of people that both he and his father were. They're real, they're down to earth, they're sincere. They don't hold anything back. And so he uses that word to link the two of them as well. They have that in common. You'll notice that he goes on to say that before anyone tells him that he's like his father, before anybody has told me this, he already knows that. So before anybody says to him, oh, you look just like your dad, or you remind me of your father, he is constantly aware of who he is as a reflection of who his father is. Now, of course, we don't necessarily know whether this is a good thing or not. He says, I see myself through my father's eyes. And so he is conscious of the fact that he is being defined by his father in the same way in which his father, has conveyed different characteristics onto him. So he sees himself as his father would see him. And he would then recognize that his father would also recognize himself through him. Whether this is good or bad, of course, depends on the relationship that he has with his father. But in this poem, you'll see that this is not necessarily a bad relationship. I think you can see already from these first two stanzas that the memories that he has of his father are not necessarily negative memories. I mean, he's talking about the fact that they both laugh. So we start out on a positive point. He moves on to go on to refer to something that was in the past. So now he reflects back to when he was younger, when I was a pigeon-toed boy. And the use of the phrase pigeon-toed is quite specific because it tells you something about what he was like as a boy. A person who stands pigeon-toed is not somebody who is assured or self-confident. Pigeon-toed reflects maybe insecurity or awkwardness, but it's a fairly light-hearted term. And he also uses the term scribble. That he refers to the way in which he got through matric as scribbling his way through matric. Now that word scribble also has quite, light-hearted connotations. It indicates that he didn't take his matric very seriously. He kind of just like scribbled through it. But it also tells you that his father, literally, but also metaphorically, used his voice to get him through matric. His father was the motivation. His father was what pushed him through. So he talks about his father using his voice in a positive sense, in the sense that he keeps order in the house. He refers to these normal day-to-day chores. His father was the disciplinarian maybe, but he used his voice to kind of maintain order. He also, though, used his voice for harsher things. So now there's a slight shift in tone because now he says that his father also got angry. He uses the word bluster, and bluster means to talk or rant in a loud, slightly aggressive way. It has a slightly more threatening connotations, but they're still not very negative connotations, because is bluster is often referred to as a wind that kind of pushes you around, maybe the wind that you might experience when you were in Cape Town. It's loud, it's noisy, but it doesn't actually do much. So he talks about his father blustering when they made a noise or when the kitchen wasn't cleared. So these are things that they were getting into trouble for. You'll notice also that he's still only talking about day-to-day household kind of things, staying out too late, not cleaning up the kitchen. This is still very much within the domestic sphere. His memories of his father are grounded in the home, in the domestic sphere. And I'm pointing this out to you now because you're going to see a slight contrast later on when he talks about what he uses his voice for. I've highlighted the word late there because you need to note that he uses the word late right at the end of this stanza, and he goes on to use it again in the following stanza. In this stanza, he's talking about his father getting angry with him when he was late. And in the next stanza, he talks about when his father is late for work. So the proximity of those two lates indicates a kind of closeness between the two of them, a similarity between the two of them. They're both late in just at different times. This next stanza is just relaying one more thing. And this again is a kind of a memory that he has. He has this memory of his dad who used to get late for work, or used to be late for work, and used to get angry when he couldn't find his things. Like in this case, his one sock. He's got one sock in hand, and the twin, in other words, the other sock, he can't find, because the twin is an angry glint in his eye, because he's angry about the fact that he can't find the sock. Again, this is just a reference to a sort of a domestic scene, a normal scene that you would have in the morning if you were getting up and getting ready to do things. This particular description alludes to the story Jack and the Beanstalk. If you're familiar with it, you'll know that the words fee, fo, fi, fum are the things that the giant used to say in Jack and the Beanstalk. So he's comparing his father to a giant, like a big angry giant that's stomping through the house. But he's still ending up standing in a pile of laundry. So even though even though his dad is angry, the anger is diffused by the slightly ludicrous or comical description of him stomping around in dirty laundry. An anagram, which I'm sure you know, is a combination of words, and he talks about his father combining anagrams of fee, fo, fi, fum. Again, although a reference to the giant could also be talking about, that it could be hinting at the fact that he's using the F word, the fee, fo, fi, fum, and it links to the bluster of the previous stanza. It's loud, it's shouting, but it's generally just ineffectual. It's a lot of bluster. It's not amounting to much, and ultimately, it just ends up with him standing in a pile of laundry, which implies that, if he's standing there in a pile of laundry, he's going to be the person that has to clean up that laundry. He talks about this stinking heap of laundry, which is possibly a reference to what happens when you shout a whole lot and you end up making a big mess, and now you've created a mess that you have to clean up. And he shifts straight away to say that he also has his father's voice. So we move now to him talking about the fact that it links back to the title, I Have My Father's Voice. This is what the poem is actually about. He has inherited the same temperament as his father. He has his fuming temper, and he shouts as he does. He gets angry about things and he shouts about them. But here, he might be referring to the fact that he's not shouting about necessarily a stinking heap of laundry, but maybe the stinking heap that is apartheid South Africa. This is the thing that he shouts about, because we know that he's a poet and he talks about those things. He's shifting here from a literal voice, the literal shouting of his father, to the more figurative, in inverted commas, shouting that he does about the things that make him angry in the world, namely apartheid. He's got the fuming temper, he's got the shouting, but it's about something else. Because the way we know that it's about something else is because the next stanza starts with but. But indicates a shift, a difference between him and his father, a contrast between him and his father. But I spew the words out. And he talks about spewing them out in pairs of alliteration and an air of assonance, which are very specific, direct references to poetic devices. He's talking about the fact that his anger is voiced through the medium of poetry. Unlike his father, he's not just standing in the middle of the room and shouting and blustering. He's actually distilling his anger into the medium of poetry. Of course, it's very meta to be using the poetic device when describing the poetic device. You'll have noticed that pairs of alliteration and air of assonance are both alliteration and assonance. So that's a direct, very uncomplicated reference to the idea of the poetic devices. He uses the word spew. And spew is to spit something out forcefully, possibly even causing harm. A volcano might spew out lava. So although the medium of poetry is controlled, he is spitting out the words. He is spitting them out with force. The anger, the use of the word spew, indicates that the anger is still present in his poetry. And he ends by saying that everything a poet needs, namely himself, or any poet perhaps, is what he got from his father, what his father bequeathed him, which is, first of all, a voice, and secondly, anger. Those are the two things that he's referred to in this poem. So he's suggesting here that what a poet needs is, first of all, a voice, and second of all, anger. He ends by saying, except the words, which is slightly ironic because he said he doesn't have the words, and yet he's just written a poem where he's used words, obviously. So although he says my father has bequeathed me everything I need except the words, by writing this poem, he actually has the words. So there's a slight irony there, but it might be suggesting that he didn't get his father's words. He's using his own words. So he might be saying, when he says accept the words, he might be saying, I got my father's anger, but I'm using my own words. I'm writing my own story. So what you can take from this is that it's slightly interesting that he would say that anger was a necessary part of poetry, but it is the anger itself that drives the poetry. What is he angry about? His father seemed to be angry about small things, the things that happen in the home. He might be angry about greater things, the injustices that he sees in the world. And he is grateful for the fact that this anger is what gives him his voice. He might also be implying, though, that unlike his father's bluster, the ineffectual bluster, his anger is hopefully more expressive. He is maybe reaching more people. It's less ineffectual than the bluster is. It might be worthwhile kind of comparing the different ways in which the father and the son use their voice, because this might give you an indication as to what his attitude towards his father's voice is. His father uses his voice to maintain discipline, to keep order in the home, but it's a literal use of the voice, whereas the son is using the voice as a poet to speak out, to voice against things that are going wrong in the world. It's a more figurative use of the voice. Whereas his father operated entirely at home, the son hopes to have a greater influence within a broader context in the world out there. So even the idea of voice, both the literal use of voice and the figurative idea of voice they're expressed in two different ways throughout this poem. And so you're left wondering what the actual tone of this poem is, because although he talks a lot about his father being angry, if you follow the progress of the poem, he starts out saying he's like his father because he laughs the same way that his father does. But then he goes on to talk about how angry his father used to get, and he escalates that as the poem goes on. It starts out with just keeping order, and then he gets angry, and then he gets even angrier. So if you recall, you had this idea that he started out laughing, then he kept order by telling them to kind of get through matric. Then he got angry with them for being late. And then he has this memory of him stomping around like a giant. So there's an escalation of anger throughout the poem. But he's not angry with his father. He's not angry at his father. It's not an angry poem. It's a poem about the anger that he was bequeathed by his father. And the use of the word bequeathed should give you some of a clue there, because when you bequeath something to somebody, that's you're giving them a gift, you're leaving them something, you're giving them something of yourself. But the implication is that it's something valuable. So it is suggested here that what he got from his father, what his father bequeathed him, is something that he values. Alternatively, he could simply resent his father for giving him empty anger without the words to express it. You could have possibly two interpretations of that. Obviously, like in any poem, you have to substantiate your interpretation. So take a look at the poem again, now that you've run through the ideas that are in it, and see whether you understand it better now that you've got a deeper understanding of some of those concepts. Reread these words and see what this poem is telling you. You can see, as I mentioned, the kind of escalation of the concept of anger and who his father was, and the progression from him as a boy to the progression of him as an adult poet. You can also see that although he talks about his father being an angry person, the tone itself of the poem is not an angry tone. He's simply talking about the thing that he gets from his father. It also leaves you with the idea that he has everything he needs from his father, and that links to the title, I have, in the present tense, my father's voice. I've got what I need to be the man that I am today. So hopefully that grants you a better understanding of the poem. As always, if you have questions, if there's anything that you don't understand, or that you aren't able to infer or extrapolate from your current understanding, then you know where to find me, you know where to direct your questions to. I'm always here to help you.